I just want to begin tonight first by just saying a little bit about myself for people who don't know who I am, as well as kind of laying the foundation for why this series is taking place this week and what are some of the goals that we'd like to accomplish. That way people don't feel like they got duped into something or they've been misinformed or whatever the case may be. First of all, my name is Sebastien Braxton, and I was originally from Chicago, Illinois. My father is an eye doctor. My mother was in medicine in terms of nursing and things like that. Eventually, my parents separated, and I've kind of lived in Chicago and Atlanta for the latter part of my adolescence. I began a degree in engineering in Georgia, and then it was interrupted by a time where I decided to join the United States Marine Corps. I did that for about a year, joined the reserve so I could go back to school and finish. About a year and a half later, I had made a decision to actually join a particular faith, and that was the Christian faith. I was about 21 going on 22 years old at the time. Subsequent to that, I accepted an invitation to come to the University of Michigan back in 2003 to serve as a part of the Association of Religious Counselors, ARC, which is a part of Student Affairs. And that organization is designed to kind of have the university express some accountability and encouragement to religious life on campus, but also to help students balance many things and to serve as extra agents of the university. Subsequent to that internship, I was asked to go to Michigan State University to do the same thing. Then I decided, it might be a good idea to finish my education. So I did that at Eastern Michigan University. I studied business finance and entrepreneurship. After that, I was invited to go to Boston by a foundation, the Center for Discipleship, and to establish a program called Stride in the Harvard-MIT area. It was taking over a house there that was usually for visiting scholars, and it was designed to inspire students to be excellent academically as well as spiritually. And accepting that invitation to go to Boston, I didn't even go to my own graduation. I immediately went out there. Things got started. Things were rolling very quickly, and I began to conduct weekly presentations there at Harvard. I was speaking at the Divinity School. And the community tea is what they have when they discuss ideas, kind of like the Areopagus in ancient Greece. And so I was doing that, and things were going really well, so well that they invited me to come back to Michigan in 2010 and run both programs from here. So as a result of that, I've been back in Michigan for several years. I'm also an itinerant speaker, whether that be secular or religious contexts. I recently just returned from Bangalore, India. And before that, I was in Munich, Germany, and then I was in Zurich. And I think I had a little break. I was doing a series called Life with No Fear at Central Michigan University in September. So I'm very busy, and then on Sunday I'll be heading to Cape Town, South Africa. And I won't spend my Christmas there, unfortunately. Very beautiful place. But I'll be back, and then January I'll get a little break and go on to Hungary. And go back there to do some other presentations for a youth conference. So that's kind of who I am. I've also was known for starting an organization at Eastern Michigan called Unbound, which is part of now the service organizations there. It is reallocating textbooks from wealthier charter schools to poor inner city schools who can't afford textbooks, gym equipment, things like that. And that was very well supported by Eastern, and I had a good experience starting that and working with the university there. It has been a pleasure for me to engage in the secular environment on these issues simply because many young people are finding that religious answers to some of the most deep existential questions of the human experience are without substance. They're not really intellectually coherent or cogent, and on top of that, they're existentially irrelevant. And so it has been my experience that students who are at the collegiate level are oftentimes more challenged in the academic arena than they are in the religious arena of life. They're challenged to think versus when you come to faith, the sense of the spirit of the age is, well, if you're a religious person, you're called not to think. You're called not to ignore evidence, things of this nature. And so this series was born out of a recent trip that I took to Austria in the summer. I was in Linz, Austria, and then after that I was leaving to go to Oslo, to Norway, to conduct a series up there. And on this plane ride, Air Berlin, this is actually a picture I took getting on the plane, and I'm glad I did. I was not aware of the experience I was about to have on this plane trip. As I got on this plane, I was actually hoping that I did not get a window seat. I'm a very tall person, and sitting on the window on the inside can be very, very uncomfortable, especially in international travel. And so in my heart, I was just really hoping that somehow this cup would pass me by. But alas, as I boarded the plane, I was confronted by the fact that I was sitting on an inside seat on a very small jet. And as the couple stepped out, I got into the seat, was getting a little more settled, and this was a couple from Dusseldorf, about 200 kilometers from Berlin. And as we began to discuss, this young lady was telling me about how she's involved in yoga and other different things, and she's just describing this amazing experience that she's been having with yoga and what it has done for her life. And I said, well, how long have you been involved in yoga? She told me 5 years. And I said, so do you have a more elaborate religious background prior to this? And she said, yes, I was raised, obviously in Europe, very heavily Catholic places as well as Protestant and others, especially in Germany. And she said, this was my experience, but as she was describing some of the disappointments and the pains and the misunderstandings and the failures that she felt she had experienced, I paused and asked her this question. I said, so do you believe, do you feel that Christianity has promised much and delivered very little? And she said, yes, that's exactly how I feel. And I was very surprised by that. Not surprised because I feel like Christianity is perfect or that it should just, boom, prima facie in your face, how can you even turn this down? As if, someone told you, I'll sell you this Apple, MacBook Pro with Retina display for $100. You kind of be like, this is a no-brainer kind of thing. But I don't believe Christianity is like that. However, I do believe that the issues in which people deal with are real. So here is a woman that was a believer, but now has arrived at a place where she says, I am no longer a believer. I feel as if Christianity has failed me. So these presentations that we'll be going through this week, not only will they serve that audience, but also, I was on the University of Michigan campus 7 years ago. There was these individuals on the corner right there on State Street across from the Union, and they were picketing outside, and I was actually traveling with a group of students. We sing at the University of Michigan Hospital for Patients. And as we were on our way to our cars, I saw these women, and they were basically talking about get rid of God, all these different things. And so I stopped, and I said, excuse me, ma'am, I was noticing your sign. I'm actually a Christian. I was curious to know why you're out here with these picketing signs. She said, well, I hate God, I hate Christians, it needs to be destroyed, it is the scourge of the earth. And I was surprised by just the polemic language with which she was speaking about these things. And so I said, was there an experience that you've had? And she said, I sent my son, I'm an atheist, I sent my son to a Christian academy because I felt as if the curriculum was good, was well-rounded, and that's why I sent my son there. And it was very close, and I wanted to put him in a private school. And I agree with most of the values, morally. But when my son went there, he was bullied, beat up, mistreated, mocked, ridiculed by other Christian students, and parents took no action against this, and this thing persisted, even with Christian teachers. And she says, my son would come home crying to me every single day. Do you know what it's like to receive your child in tears every day you pick them up from the bus stop? Only to discover that this was from a Christian institution. And then to go to the principal and to the chancellor and the individuals involved and say, can you make some changes for my son? And only to find out, hey, look, we're doing the best that we can. And look, sometimes God allows these things for other reasons. And I was shocked. And I saw, again, another audience for which these presentations are tailored to. People who may have been hurt by agents and proposed carriers of Christianity. And lastly, because there are some very angry atheists as a result of those two experiences that I've just described. And so tonight I want to start off with a young woman. Her name is Greta Christina. She's an atheist blogger, and I actually like reading atheist blogs personally. I have some good friends who are atheists, very staunch atheists. We have very electrifying and passionate discussions about religious things and politics and other things. But the thing that binds us together as friends, despite our religious differences, is the fact that we believe and desire intellectually sound answers to our questions. And we believe in reading. Some reason people don't read these days. They use the excuse, I'm young, I'm busy, for excuses to not be informed on critical issues of life. And so this is what binds us together as friends. And so Greta Christina, as I've noticed on different atheist blogs, they say she articulates for us when Christians say, why are atheists so angry? And she says, these are the reasons why I'm angry. And I'm going to give you a little heads up. I had to edit some of her language because she's angry. And she articulates it with a certain savviness that I've not found on any other writings of an atheist blogger. So I wanted to share with you 10 reasons that she says atheists are angry out of her 45 I think I found on her blog. So number one, she says, why are atheists angry? She says, I'm angry that atheist conventions have to have extra security, including handheld metal detectors and bag searches because of the fatwas and the death threats. Fatwas is a Muslim rule that is made as a result of a religious tradition. I want to go into all of that. But also people are making death threats at atheist conventions. And she says, I'm angry. I'm angry that atheist soldiers in the U.S. Armed Forces have had prayer ceremonies pressured on them and atheist meetings broken up by Christian superior officers in direct violation of the First Amendment. She says, this is why I'm angry. She says, I'm angry that the 41st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, said of atheists, in my lifetime, no, I don't know that atheists should be regarded as citizens, nor should they be regarded as patriotic. This is one nation under God. Can you imagine? The king of Saudi Arabia saying, you know, I don't consider Muslim people to be citizens. Or to even go farther, to say you go out to, let's say I was in India recently, and if Christians felt this way in a country, you begin to feel very threatened and endangered when the very president, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, says you are not really regarded as a citizen at all. Why are atheists angry? She says, I'm angry at preachers who tell women in their flock to submit to their husbands because it's the will of God, even when their husbands are beating them within an inch of their lives. She says, that's why I'm angry. She says, I'm angry that so many believers treat prayer as a sort of cosmic shopping list for God. I'm angry that believers pray to win sporting events, poker hands, beauty pageants, and more, as if they were the center of the universe, as if God gives a blank blank about who wins the NCAA Final Four, and as if the other teams, players, and contestants weren't praying just as hard. The issue of competition. I'm angry at the Sunday school teacher who told comic artist Craig Thompson that he couldn't draw in heaven. And I'm angry that she said it with the complete conviction of authority, when in fact she had no basis whatsoever for that assertion. How the blank does she know what heaven was like? How could she possibly know that you could sing in heaven but not draw? And why the hell would you say something that's squelching and dismissive to a talented child? I'm angry at the trustee of the local Presbyterian church who told his teenage daughter that he didn't actually believe in God or religion, but that it was important to keep up his work because without religion there would be no morality in the world. I'm angry I get angry when believers say at the beginning of an argument that their belief is based on reason and evidence, and at the end of the argument say things like, it just seems that way to me, or I feel it in my heart, as if that were a clincher. I mean, couldn't they have said that at the beginning of the argument and not wasted my blank time? You can tell she's angry. I'm angry that I have to know more about their religion than the believers do. I get angry when believers say things about the tenets and texts of their religion that are flatly untrue, and I have to correct them on it. And I get angry when believers act as if these offenses aren't important, because not all believers act like that. I don't act like that, as if that blinking matters. This stuff is a major way that religion plays out in our world, and it makes me furious to hear religious believers try to minimize it because it's not how it happens to play out for them. And it's like a white person responding to an African American describing their experience of racism by saying, but I'm not a racist. If you're not a racist, then you can shut the blank up for 10 seconds and listen to the black people talk. And if you're not bigoted against atheists and are sympathetic to us, then you can shut up for 10 seconds and let us tell you about what the world is like for us without getting all defensive about how it's not your fault. When did this international conversation about atheism and religious oppression become all about you and your hurt feelings? Mohandas Gandhi made this statement. He said, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians, because your Christians are so unlike your Christ. Did you know that the roots of Gandhi's passive resistance comes from the Sermon on the Mount that was given by Jesus? He actually made this statement to a friend of his who was Christian. And people would oftentimes ask Gandhi, are you going to become a Christian? Gandhi is actually, to me, one of the most inspiring people in history. Just personally, from reading about his life, learning about the things that he did and what he taught, and even how he believed you find meaning in life through the supernormal life. Not living in palaces and luxury, but living like the people you seek to lead. And he told his friend, when he asked him, Gandhi, why don't you just become a Christian if you follow the teachings of Jesus? And Gandhi said, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians, because your Christians are so unlike your Christ. I suggest to you, rather than me going through the intellectual breaking down of the question, has Christianity failed you? Is that we go through these things simply to establish fundamental basic ideas. Number one, we want to be clear, what is it that has actually failed the woman who sent her son to the school? What is it that actually failed the woman on the plane to Berlin? What is it that actually failed this angry atheist? What is it that actually failed Gandhi? Who said, if he, which tomorrow we'll deal with this, that Gandhi made another statement where he said, you know, I'll be glad to become a Christian as soon as I meet one. This is the thing that was holding him back. I find no one that is literally what the word Christian means, a follower of Christ, who lives according to the principles of Jesus' life, who have more fidelity to the man on which the religion is built than the religion itself. And in this sense, we can establish, is it Christianity that has truly failed us? Or is it the people who are supposed to be the propaganders of this religion and its tenets? As we have always said in intellectual discussion, we do not judge a philosophy by its abuse. We understand that. It is a fundamental principle. Just as you would say, because people use knives to murder people, doesn't make knives wrong. As we say, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Tonight, I want to go into this topic simply because as the fundamental issue, Gandhi spells it out for us. That as with Gandhi, many people are like, I have no problem with Jesus. If you notice, the 10 things that I gave you from the angry atheist woman had nothing to do with Jesus. His name never appeared in any of her remarks. I read them all. The woman that I was talking to on the plane to Berlin, Jesus never appeared in her remarks or her concerns. When I was talking to the woman who sent her son to this Christian academy, who was being bullied and abused, Jesus never appeared in the words in which she was making. So to understand who is Jesus, what did he claim, and what are the implications of those teachings, may make it very clear to us, abundantly clear, that it is not actually Christianity, the teachings and the examples left by Jesus Christ himself, but it could be the church rather than Christ. So we come to a point now where we recognize two things. One, we know atheists agree. Two, we know Gandhi agrees. The question is, what about God? Is this how God feels? Does he feel like, I like Jesus, I don't like your Christians because your Christians are so unlike your Christ? Becomes the question, and that's the title of our lecture, where these three individuals agree. Atheists, no God. Gandhi, through Hinduism, all gods are accepted. And then you have the exclusivity of the Christian God. I want to use the words of Jesus himself to initiate us tonight, because, as I said, these lectures for this week are not going to be 1 hour of me talking to you for 1 hour, trying to break down some intellectual thing, etc., etc. I want to give time for actually question and answers, because this issue, has Christianity failed you, is never going to be articulated in 1 hour unless people's existential, personal questions and issues are not addressed and acknowledged as either valid or invalid. So these first 30 minutes, I'm just simply trying to establish a basis, but then the second portion of this time is for you all to engage me personally with whatever questions that you have. And that obviously goes for the people who maybe even be watching on live stream, to type in questions, whatever, and Jeffrey's there and he can articulate those just the same. But to conclude this portion of our lecture before we continue tomorrow evening, I want to start off with the Sermon on the Mount and what it means exegetically in the text of Scripture as well as in the ministry of Christ. First of all, we recognize that in Jesus' ministry, and in the book of Matthew in particular, it is very important that in analyzing any text, which this applies to the writings of King Arthur, to Shakespeare, to many things, is that we understand, obviously, this word context, right? So you have the juxtaposition of these two Latin words. You have con, you have textere, which is woven together. So there's things that are woven into this thing. And we must consider that Matthew, when he wrote his book, he was not writing for the people who are in the stories of the book. Matthew was written in 54 AD, somewhere between 54 to 60 AD. And he was not writing for the individual John the Baptist in Matthew chapter 3. That's not who he was writing for. So when we talk about the biblical audience, we must be referring to who are the individuals that Matthew was writing to at this time. And what was he trying to convey to them? So that in the genealogy of Matthew, we find that he begins with Abraham. He does not go back, as Luke does, all the way back to Adam. He simply says, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. Not only does he do that, in his genealogy, he only does 14 generations, 3 times in each portion, and he also includes women, 4 of them. Tamar, a prostitute, Rahab, a prostitute. Why does he include these things? And what is he trying to say, is the question. And so he records the book of Matthew in a very unique fashion, where he seems to balance the words of Jesus with the deeds of Jesus. And in the words, he separates it into 5 major what we call discourses. These 5 discourses. And they are chapters long. These 5 discourses are critical to understanding the Gospel of Matthew. That before Jesus gets up and he starts talking about the Sermon on the Mount, you have the birth of Christ first. We already have his genealogy, so we have his birth in chapter 2. Then after we go to his birth, we go to the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. Then after we go to the Baptist and Jesus is baptized, then we go to Jesus in the wilderness of temptation. Then we go to Jesus preaching in his hometown. Now, as Christ goes through these different experiences, then Jesus comes and gives the Sermon on the Mount, which is 3 chapters long. Chapters 5 through 7. And the question is, why are all these multitudes waiting? After this man has gone through all of these experiences, now Matthew says, at this point in time, I'm going to place these words of Jesus, even though Luke and other people put them in different places, for different purposes, for different audiences. This Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes an interesting correlation. I'm just going to deal with chapter 5 for tonight as it applies to us. Jesus begins to give a certain set of these diatribes, so to speak. And he starts off with this phrase, right? He says, "You have heard." Every time. And he specifically addresses the 2 different areas. First of all, he deals with the Decalogue, 10 Commandments. Decalogue. And then he obviously deals with some of the other Levitical commands in the Old Testament. And in this Decalogue, he says, well, you have heard that it was said by them of old that you should do no murder. This is what he says. This is what you heard. And then he goes, and in every single one, he transitions and he says, but I say to you. The fundamental issue in the Gospel of Matthew is the kingdom of heaven. And this first discourse tells you what is the nature of the kingdom of heaven, what are the principles, what is the governing law of the kingdom that Jesus, they believe, as the Messiah of the Old Testament, is coming to establish. And as they're thinking, oh, for sure, he's going to come and start talking about all these laws that we're supposed to be keep, because it's all about the law. That's what Torah means. So, but Jesus comes and says, yeah, this is what you've heard. Everyone's like, yeah, we've heard this, but says, this is what I say unto you. And the last one that he says is, he says, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And then he says, but I say unto you. It's like everyone's listening. And Jesus says these words. He says, but I say unto you, love your enemies. Do good to them who persecute you. Pray for those people, right, who hate you and despitefully abuse you. Now think about this. So Christ says, this is what I'm saying unto you. And this is, I'm going somewhere with this, so you have to follow this reasoning. Because Christ is saying, he's building a case throughout the whole chapter. You have heard, but I say. You have heard, but I say. You have heard, but I say. And when he comes to this last one, which eventually he will tell someone, this is the greatest commandment in the law. And he comes and he says, you have heard this, but this is what I'm saying unto you. Love your enemies. That seems to be almost a contradiction for what they have heard from others. And Christ is saying, I'm not coming to get rid of the law, I'm coming to give proper understanding. And so he arrives at this place where he says, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you, pray for those who hate you, etc. And then he says, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven. Say, wait, everyone immediately in the crowd becomes confused. So what do you mean? This is so that we may love our enemies, do good to the people who hate us, pray for those who despitefully use us and persecute us. He says, yes, this is the evidence that you are children of your Father in heaven. The evidence has nothing to do with ethnocentricity. That many people, what they have issues with religion is, this is a culture that you've been brought up in, and it is superior to another culture. That's what it eventually turns into. Or we have individuals say, well, mine's just more intellectually coherent. And he says, look, the proof that you are from God is not the intellectual coherence of what you're saying. It is your ability to treat people irregardless of how they treat you, how they disagree with you, how they treat you, not only in the sense of, well, I took you out for a ride, you didn't pick me up when I needed a ride. No, Jesus says we're talking about people who desire our worst condition. We're talking about people who hate us, who have no love for us. And he says the very evidence that we come from God, that this is what will properly represent him, is our ability to love people who do not think like us. Not only do people who don't think like us, people who have no love for us. And then he points to this example in creation. And he says, for God sends his Son on the just and on the unjust. And he sends his rain on the good and on the evil. He says, when you look at creation, if you say that God has created things, any religion of Christianity, any sect that says we believe that God is the one who created the world in 6 literal, contiguous, 24-hour days. Jesus says, when you look at creation, that God, you know, when the atheist walks outside, he gets sunshine too. You know, when the atheist farmer is sowing his seeds in the field, God sends rain on his crops just the same. You think God only sends the rain for the people who are following him? And then he saves and reserves the blessings for the people? You say, no, you guys don't get this. I saved this for these people. He says, when you look in creation, you find the same God that you're fighting for, that you're going around espousing and trying to Bible beat people over the head with. That same God blesses the very people that you curse. And as a result of this, Christ says, according to Matthew, Jesus' words match his deeds. And when Christ gets up and says, love your enemies, guess who's in the audience? It's like the age-old antagonists, Pharisees and Sadducees, scribes and priests, who have been plotting the death of Jesus from a very early time of his ministry. And this is a man who bore with them. And even when it came time where they desired his own blood from the hands of Rome, Christ lifted up no curse against them. Why would a man who is innocently accused, hanging on a cross, because his own nation and spiritual leaders are chanting, crucify him, why would his response not be, you evil, hypocritical, wicked? None of these come from his mouth. The first words out of his mouth are, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And for many of these individuals who are atheists, and they say, this is why I'm angry. Why in the world would George Bush get up and say People who are atheists should not be regarded as citizens. This is a Christian nation under God. In the same breath, he will employ the name of God and then tell these people, you're not citizens. And yet that same God that he claims this nation is under blesses them just the same. The essential reality of love was the heart of Jesus' message. I'm going there first before I get into the intellectual tomorrow. Because we can start with the intellectual and miss the very heart of what Christ is trying to say and do. That he comes down and recognizes we live in a world where God is misunderstood. And then not only is God misunderstood, God is misrepresented by the people who are supposed to clear up the misconception. And I end with these remarks and then a story. If any person has done a careful study of Scripture, Old and New Testament, you will immediately be confronted by the reality that the people that God is grappling with the most in the Bible are his own people. He has no problem wrestling with the Assyrians. No problem dealing with the Canaanites. No problem with the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, whatever ites in the Bible. He has no problem dealing with them. The people that he struggles, when the Bible says in Ezekiel that God bangs his fists, it is not over heathen people. He's trying to figure out, you who are my own people, called by my name, the streets run with blood out of jealousy. This is what God cannot figure out. How do I get my people to be more like me? That is his question. And so where atheists have issues, where Gandhi had issues, we find that the whole of Scripture says the same issues exist in the mind of God. Why are my Christians so unlike my Christ? I end with this story. I was at the University of Botswana, and I was conducting a series of meetings there, and this man who was driving me back and forth, I noticed he kept talking about his wife, but I never saw his wife. And I asked, I said, so is your wife kind of not interested in these things, or is she working? He said, no, she's interested in these kind of things. I said, so is there a reason why she doesn't come out? He says, well, years ago, she was a Christian, and she was dating a Christian man. And while they were dating, eventually things kind of escalated. She got pregnant. And African churches tend to be, a little more serious about dealing with sin than a lot of churches that you see in America. And as a result of this, they came to the church, it became known, and they said, look, brother, either you guys need to get married, and they were engaged to be married, and so they thought this would settle it. But then he decided, you know what, I don't want to do this. So he broke up with her, married her best friend in the same church, and she ended up being banished from the church. After the baby was born, and I've been to Botswana, it is a hot place, very dry. And as she would be walking down the street, former churchgoers of that same church would pass her by while her baby is tied to her back and she's carrying all these groceries, miles, in the hot Botswanan sun. And one day, her child is probably about 5-6 months at this point. She goes to the store, and while she's walking there, a woman pulls over in a station wagon. She says, excuse me, are you heading to the marketplace? She says, yes, I am. She says, well, I am as well. Would you like to get a ride there with your baby? She said, sure. So she hopped in the car. She got to the marketplace. She says, I'll take you back to where you live. I have no problem with that. Just get what you need. And don't be, bashful about what you need at your house, because I can drive you back. You don't have to carry it. So the lady said, okay. So she's going around filling her cart, She gets to the register only to find out the woman said to her, the other lady already paid for your order. She said, okay. So then they go back. As they go back, they are having this discussion, and she says, why don't you go ahead and take my car? I'll call my husband to pick me up. We have 2 cars. And meet us here in 2 weeks, and then I can get the car back from you. And of course, she was like, no, this is like, there's no way I can take your car. This is crazy. And the lady said, I insist, please. And she just jumped out of the car, left it running, and she said, I'm going to call my husband. So she got in the car and drove it home. And now, obviously, if people lend you a vehicle, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. You're going to bring the car back. So she brings the car back 2 weeks later. The woman meets her there. She's at the marketplace. Same time, everything. And she says, well, get the groceries. And so she thought this time, I'm not going to let her pay, so I'm going to go to a different cashier. But no, she came to the cashier, and she was like, yeah, so here, I'm ready to pay for my groceries. She says, no, this lady already paid for your groceries. She told us whatever register you went to just to charge it. Okay, thank you. So she goes to see the lady. She says, thanks. She hands her the keys back, or she's trying to hand her the keys back. And the woman says, no, keep the keys. She's like, excuse me? She says, my husband and I, we've thought about this, and we have 2 vehicles. You have a baby, and you live so far away, so we thought, you can keep the car for good. And the woman was shocked. And then as she was getting into the car, she said, are you sure? She said, no, I just need your license and information, and we'll change the title over to your name. And at this point, the woman's getting tears in her eyes. And they said, we also bought a car seat for the baby. And she says, I don't understand. She says, well, we just want you to know, my husband and I, that we sympathize with your situation. And we understand what it's like to have children and to be a single mother. We can only imagine the difficulty of that in this kind of area, an environment without a vehicle. I mean, how would you get anywhere? So they said, we just decided this is what we wanted to do. And we also want you to know that we go to this church up the street. And if you ever want to come, no pressure at all. You and your baby are always accepted. And then he looked at me and he said, Sebastien, guess what church she goes to? I said, that church. He said, of course. And he said, my wife doesn't even believe all the doctrines that they teach in that church. But she goes there because she is loved. Because she is loved. And this is the legacy that Jesus was intending to leave on the earth. That we would always be accused of loving those who even the world considered to be unlovable. And in this Christian nation, sometimes the most unlovable people in the eyes of the public are atheists. People who have been disenfranchised and abused by people who claimed in the name of religion. And so, I end this first lecture with what I believe by a simple basis of argument and the simplicity of what Christ is trying to say, is that this is the essential reality of his message. If he is the Son of God, as Christians claim, and he says the evidence that you are his child is your ability to give love regardless of what is given to you, then we who claim to follow him must espouse the same principles of action. And therefore, if there is someone who has found, like this angry atheist, or this woman who sent her son to be bullied, or this woman on the plane to Berlin, I would tell you, God, Gandhi, and atheists agree. Sometimes our Christians are very unlike our Christ. I'd like to open it up for any questions that you may have. And And obviously, I have no qualms about you don't have to be bashful in your questions. You can be blunt and upfront. And my goal will be to try to repeat the questions just for the recording in case people cannot hear. But nevertheless, I'm open to any questions. Each of these presentations are designed to stand on their own. And so you don't have to be afraid and to say, look, I'll go into these things more and more, because I understand students are not always able to make all the lectures in a week-long series. Just schedules do not permit it to be so. So, yeah, are there any questions that people might have? Yes.
I was wondering whether you can explore the aspect of why sometimes Christians why they cannot love the way they profess to.
That Jesus was asking them to love. So the question is, can we explore a little deeper why it is that Christians struggle or cannot love the way that Jesus has taught and what the example of his legacy? I think there's a few things. Number one is the argument of the Christian worldview is that love is something that has its origin in God. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 13, as well as 1 John chapter 4. There's many scriptures that say, look, God is love. He who loves is of God. And that even when people love outside of the Christian faith, it is a sign of the light of Christ that is in that person's life. And so the Christian worldview basically argues the fact that it is not enough for us to engage in the externals of religion, but that Christ's desire was always internal. So his thing was to work from the inside of the person's heart to the outward expression. Versus many Christians, professors of followers of Jesus, have gotten into the externals of religion and lost the substance and the inward reality of it. And therefore, the Jews consumed with the temple. Even today, you can look at some of our Christian buildings and edifices and complexes and compounds. I mean, I've been to churches where you walk in, the floor is marble. You have a mural the size of this wall of just the pastor's head as he smiles with a gold tooth. I mean, these things are just absurd. The amount of money that is spent on that, and you begin to wonder, have we forgotten what this thing is all about? That here, and I'm going to tell you the truth. When I was in college, I went into that church when I was not a Christian. And I did not leave thinking, wow, God has really blessed these people. You know what I walked away thinking? Jesus was poor and had nowhere to lay his head. And the people who follow him have now built themselves big buildings. I said, I don't know. And I'm not here to decide on which pastors are following and which are not. But simply to say, it could easily be understood why people would think we have fallen into the issues of greed within religion. And we use religion as a means to get gain in this world. When Christ, his whole emphasis was of the world to come. And to use the goods and the material things of this world, as well as the immaterial gifts and talents, in order to bless others through this love that he left us to give. So I think many Christians, number one, there is a reality that love does not come within us. It is not natural, even for a professed believer. I think the second thing to recognize is the Bible also teaches the principle that we love because he first loved us. And so love awakens love. And though people grow up in religious homes, does not mean they have experienced love as God intended love to be experienced, even from their own parents. And therefore, people learn to love by how they are loved. This is where the whole love language thing begins to even become popular, because if our parents did not grow up hugging us all the time, it's very likely that when we grow up, we're not a hugging kind of person. And it's no different in the Christian church that if we didn't grow up with affirmation, we have a hard time affirming people. I didn't get that. That's not an expression of love. And there's this thing in psychology they call emotional object constancy. And emotional object constancy is this transition where a baby, at first, it begins to see itself as completely the same as its mother. So if you take it away from its mother, it feels kind of like, I'm lost. I have no point of reference. But there comes a point where the child says, now I can crawl away, I can walk away from my mom. Why? Because psychologically, they say in the child's mind, emotionally, they are so connected with their mother. They felt her touch so much. She's held them so much. She's kissed them so much. She's fed them so much. She's been there and rocked them to sleep so much that the child says, even though I don't feel my mother there physically, in my heart emotionally, I always feel as if she is with me. And now I've achieved emotional object constancy, where the object is always emotionally with me. And I think when we watch the development of a child, we learn a lot about the development of adults. That we can do things for a moment, but we don't create emotional object constancy. And I believe it was a lesson that God has built into creation of how we ought to even learn how to be loved. But if we don't develop that, we don't cultivate that, it's hard for us to give what we do not have. So I think that is the short answer to that question. And obviously Christians are in need of the same grace that they preach. Any other questions? Please don't be shy. Yes. You said about AIDS and war? Hate and war. Yes. What Jesus says about hate and war. Definitely broad topics. First of all, in terms of hate, Christ is against hate. Hate is exactly the very antithesis of God. So that even in religion, hate can be in a religious person's life, and therefore they are devoid of God. So when the Jews were saying, this man, he claims that he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days and all these different things, and then they're at the cross, while they're saying, look, we're trying to exalt our law and protect our religious rules, they're actually trampling on the very law that they're trying to defend by acting in hatred towards Christ. So number one, in terms of hatred, Christ is completely against hatred. That is one of his messages. It is his crusade, is to rid the world of all hate, including within the church. And therefore, when I was at Eastern Michigan University and they had a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender meeting where they were discussing possible ways by which the Christian community could engage with these individuals in a civil manner, I went to that meeting as one of the only people that was not LGBT, and I'm sitting in the audience watching the movie, and I mean, it's totally a caricature of these extreme Christians who are like burning churches for accepting gay members and, I mean, chalking their driveways. God didn't create Adam and Steve, he created Adam and Eve, and they painted the building the next day at Eastern Michigan University, kind of the equivalent to the Rock here at UMich, and they basically painted it with all of this hateful language towards homosexuality. And even though those people claim to be religious, Jesus is against that because it's hate. In terms of war, there's two levels of issues to the question of war in the mind of Christ. Number one, Jesus was misunderstood when he came because they expected the Messiah, which is the Hebrew term of what he would be called if the Jews accepted him as that. But Matthew's argument is he is the fulfillment of what we were looking for. And the word Messiah comes from the Hebrew word mashach, which means to anoint. And so he is the anointed one, i.e. he is filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, as a result of that, they expected that because Jesus would be a son of David, we're going to get into these things a little more in depth tomorrow, that David was a king, he was a man of war, he was conquering and doing all these things. They expected that Christ, who would be the son of David, would also come as a conqueror to deliver them from the Roman yoke. They expected him to engage in war. And they thought, how crazy is this, right? If we have Jesus as our general, and when we're walking in the field against the Romans and we're starving, he can turn 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed a multitude. Or even if, one soldier is down and a Roman soldier slices him in half, Jesus can heal him. Raise him from the dead. We'll never lose. And so some were so eager, these Jewish zealots, to make him king. because they thought, for sure, we cannot lose. But they misunderstood. And so in the second dialogue in the book of Matthew, Matthew 13, where Jesus deals with the nature of the kingdom of heaven, he gives the first parable, which is the parable of the sower. And he eventually will say the sower is the Son of Man. And therefore, I did not come as a conquering king or a man riding on Calvary in terms of riding a horse. But he says, I came as a sower to implant a new principle in the hearts of men. And so when it comes to war, Christ says that is not my method. It is not my work. And tomorrow we'll talk about that in terms of Napoleon. When he comes to his assistant, and Napoleon turns to his assistant and he says, what do you think about Jesus Christ? And his assistant's like, honestly, sir, I have no answer. And Napoleon says, look, I myself can move crowds and instigate dedication by my own presence and my words, and yet Jesus can command so much dedication in his absence. And Napoleon begins to give insight into Jesus, into what he believes that he has to offer. And so in terms of hate and war, Christ is not supportive of those approaches. In the Old Testament, which people tend to quote, which is the second level of the question, Joshua, Judges, all these different things. What about these situations of war? Number one, God has never wanted his nation to be engaged in war. It was never his intention. Before, he said always in Deuteronomy and in Exodus, God would send an angel ahead of you, and that the Lord would fight for you. We see this in the story of 2 Chronicles 20 with Jehoshaphat. There is no war. The people march out with the singers in the front. And when they get to the Assyrian army, they all scatter and run, and they collect all their goods and gold. What was happening? Well, God sent an angel into the camp. So in God's mind, it was never his goal that his people would be engaged in war, shedding of blood. But because Israel was obsessed with being like the other nations, and depending upon the arm of flesh and humanity, they wanted to have an army. They wanted to have a king. They need to have a guard. They need to have all these different things. And therefore, as a result of that, we see the Old Testament wars cultivating. And therefore, God worked with the hardness of their hearts. And then essentially, he would say, look, only he, God himself, would justify any war of any kind. Himself. And this, we simply derive from the fact that God is the author of life and that life belongs to him. And therefore, God cannot murder because he is not taking something that does not belong to him. All life belongs to him. It is a gift from him, and he can take it back at any time he desires. But obviously, we understand his character controls. In terms of his love, his compassion, and his graciousness, controls when he makes that decision to take away that life. And so, in the wars in the Old Testament, they're not justified in the sense that God believes in war, but in the sense that war would only take place if God even allows it and orders it, and two, he knows when a person's life is ready to be taken. And he just used human beings as his objects of judgment, rather than them of their own will. I'm going to kill you because you're a heretic. No, that never happened in the Old Testament. It was simply by the instigation of God. Does that help answer your question?
So, is allowed when it comes to defense?
You mean like self-defense?
Yes.
It's a good question. You know, a lot of people deal with this issue, like let's say someone breaks into your house and, you know, they're attacking, like I have a wife and I have a daughter. So if someone came into my house, right, to go after my wife, and my supposed to be like, I'm a Christian, so, you know, I can't really do anything. And I'm like, please, can you just leave, sir? Right? And he's taking all my stuff, hitting my wife. Like, no, I don't believe Jesus believes in that kind of passivity. What I believe is what Gandhi was trying to make, the point of you do not show an evil man his evil by being evil towards him. And so when Gandhi was interviewed by Life magazine, when Hitler was starting the Second World War, and the Life magazine said, so Gandhi, would you recommend the Allied powers to take the same approach of passive resistance? And Gandhi said, of course. And then the woman said to Gandhi, she said, don't you think many lives will be lost? And he says, are not many lives being lost now? He says, if you respond to a violent man with violence, he will respond in violence. Of course. But if you want to show a man the results of his evil, you do not respond. So on one hand, I don't believe that Jesus' point is on a micro scale that, yes, if someone comes into my house, I should not try to detain them. I don't believe that. In terms of defense, I believe there is a point for defense. Christ, oftentimes when people were trying to lay hands upon him or trying to murder him in the Gospels, it would often say he slipped out of the crowd. Christ wasn't trying to get into confrontation in the beginning. He's saying, hey, I can see where this thing is going, and he would remove himself from the situation. On the second level, if it is unavoidable, right, it's unavoidable, then I say, look, I on one hand, as a follower of Christ, have to acknowledge that, yes, I have a right to defend what is mine, my wife, my house, whatever, my child. But at the same token, I must keep in mind the balance of priority and value. And this is illustrated by Elizabeth Elliot, her husband, Jim Elliot. They went to South America, to an unentered region, to reach out to the natives there with the gospel. And when they were landing their plane, they're called the Alca Indians, and they thought they were dropping off gifts and food. But there became some intertribal tension, and that intertribal tension, they blamed it on what they called the white men, the pale men. They're the ones who caused this problem. So these two members of the Alca Indians went out to kill them, seeing the plane landing. So when Jim Elliot and his three friends were there, and these men were all married, some of them had children. And while they were there, these Alca Indians came and they said, look, we're putting our guns down, they're coming with these spears, etc., etc. And Jim Elliot and his friends were killed. Now, eventually, the Alca Indians were actually won, and they came to Christianity, etc., etc. But the powerful point was, in his diary, he said, I will never shoot them, because he said, I know where my salvation lies. And therefore, because I know that I have faith in Christ in my life, I will go to heaven if I die. But if I take their lives, what will happen? And so there's definitely a sense of a principle to be derived, that sometimes God wants to use our lives and sometimes he wants to use our death, but only he would make that plain at that time. But as a general principle, Christ is against war. Any other questions before we conclude? Yes?
And atheists profess to be not of God. So yet they display signs of morality written about in the Bible and God's word.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how this plays about.
So how do we reconcile the fact that people who are not of God still live moral lives? Yeah. Is that the
and Christians can even learn from how.
Yes, atheists and their. That's correct. That's correct. No, you're hitting the point right on the nail on the head. In terms of how do we reconcile, the problem that Christians raise with atheists in terms of the question of morality is that every worldview that exists has to answer four basic questions: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin, where do you come from? How do you explain why there is something rather than nothing? Meaning, how do you find meaning in life? What gives your life any significance? Morality, how do you determine right from wrong? That applies to everyone. That is not culturally bound or situationally bound. And in destiny, what do you do with death? What do you tell the people in the Rwandan genocide who lost their loved ones? What do you tell people in Cambodia or in Stalin's regime or during the reign of Mao Zedong? What do you tell them? And so when Christians bring the accusation of morality without God to atheists, they say, look, we're not saying that atheists cannot be moral. The Bible says in the book of Romans, Paul says, look, the Gentiles, which the word Gentile means a person who is estranged from God. This person has no connection with God at all. They are aliens to the commonwealth of God and to his promises. And Paul, writing to these people in Rome, he says, look, the Gentiles are a law unto themselves. And they do by nature the things contained in the law without having the law. They don't even have the Bible, and yet they're doing things by their very nature, their better nature, that are in the law. And therefore they are a law unto themselves, Paul says. So, number one, the Bible is completely in agreement with the fact that a person can be a completely estranged individual from the religion of Christ and still be living a moral life. However, what the Bible does not agree with is that a person who is estranged from God cannot be living a righteous life. Morality and righteousness are not the same thing. That is the issue of Scripture, is how do we find ourselves righteous before God? That's Micah's question. With what shall I come before the Lord? Shall I come with thousands of rams or thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? How do I reconcile the evil that I have done under the law of God? And that question of righteousness is what the Bible seeks to argue and what Christ seeks to bring. Not morality, but the issue of righteousness. A clean heart before God. Clean hands, clean feet. Now, the second part to answering that issue of atheists, being moral is Christians are saying you can be a moral person, but intellectually your worldview cannot be coherent for you to establish transcendent moral values without the existence of some superior transcendent being. For example, during the Nuremberg trials after World War II, when the, I think it's the International Justice Tribunal, whatever, the people do war crimes. And as they're talking to some of these people, right, Himmler and all these people work for Hitler, and they said, look, sir, were you aware that you were putting people in the oven, all these kind of crazy things, crimes going on in these concentration camps? And constantly they would respond to the tribunal. They would say, sir, it was German law to do these things. It was against the law for me to help a Jew in Germany. Why did you not help these young Jewish boys who were starving to death? Sir, it was against the law to help a young Jewish boy. And eventually one of the members of the tribunal became frustrated with these answers. And the issue, he said, was, is there not a law above our laws? And the man leaned to the mic and he said, sir, I'm not aware of any laws that are above our laws. What laws are above our laws in Germany? If you remove God, how do you tell a man in Germany what he is doing is wrong? On what basis do you do that? When Bertrand Russell was grappling with this with Frederick Copleston, Catholic priest, and they were having this debate, he says, Bertrand, how do you tell right from wrong? And Bertrand Russell, who was the atheist, arguing from the atheist worldview, he said, well, easily. He said, the same way I tell between yellow and blue. He says, well, you do that by seeing, don't you? It's like, yeah, exactly. So how do you tell between right and wrong? He says, well, by how I feel. So Copleston looked at him and he said, so then, some people, like to eat their neighbors. Other people like to take them out for lunch. Which do you feel like doing? You can't use feeling as a basis for morality. Sometimes you feel like being nice to your wife. Sometimes you don't. Do you base it on your feelings? I feel like going to class. I don't feel like going to class. I feel like, slapping this kid on my way to class to CC Little. I don't feel like it. So the basis of a transcendent morality is difficult to establish without God, a transcendent being that says, look, there's accountability to us all. So that's where the Christians try to raise the issue with morality with atheism. Because they say, in your worldview, if there is nothing, how then can a person in America tell someone in Germany what you're doing is wrong? Or in your culture, like in the Middle East. In some cultures of the Middle East, women are not allowed to be educated. How can you tell them that's wrong? On what basis? When in the Quran and in their current worldview, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the question. Sorry, I saw your hand.
Also, didn't like the Catholic Church sort of said it was okay to do what was going on during the Holocaust?
Yes, they did.
So then, most of those men were also underneath the idea, because he mentioned that Germans were also very deeply Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So they're understanding that what they're doing is also said by men in power within the church okay.
Mm-hmm. It's true. It's
So
true.
they felt that they were also going with like, oh well, the Pope said it's okay, hence God's okay with what I'm doing with Jews. It's all right.
It's true. And what she's referring to, certain Catholic leadership there in Germany had said, we have no problem with what's happening with the Jews. And there was this idea being spread called blood libel, which is the idea that Jews are responsible for the blood of Christ. And in the Gospel of Matthew, when the Jews said, when Pilate said, look, I wash my hands of this, they said, look, his blood be upon us and our children. And so some Christians believe that the Holocaust happened to Jews, ridiculously so, and I want to go on record saying I do not agree with it, but they believe the Holocaust happened as retribution for the blood of Christ, which is obviously untenable for us to accept, because the biblical teachings, we all are guilty of the blood of Christ by our participation in sin and in rebellion against his law. So, but that's why some people gave the green light and felt no problem with the Holocaust. Said, you killed Jesus, so this is what you get. It's a hellish thought, but some people believe it. Well, anyway, thank you for your time. I'll stick around if you have some more personal questions and want to dialogue. We'll be back here tomorrow, 7:30. We will start on time.